Story about airplanes and people, a story that's happening now near Montreal and Toronto, but could happen near other Canadian cities. Some time ago, Saint Scholastique was chosen as the site for Montreal's second international airport. This spring, Pickering Township was chosen for a second airport for Toronto. Even though on holiday weekends it may feel as if the whole country is taking off or landing at the same time, particularly if you happen to be near Toronto Airport this weekend, actually only 17% of Canadians actually flew last year. 7.5 million people, Canadians and foreigners, used Toronto's airport last year. Within 30 years, some 60 million people will be flying in and out of Toronto every year. Federal Transport Minister Don Jamieson and Ontario Treasurer Darcy McHugh, between them, will be responsible for public expenditures in the billions. But for the people in the region, it's not just a question of money right now. The new airport at Pickering will be 3 times the size of Toronto's present airport. Building it will involve bulldozing the entire village of Brougham, and the government will take over 43,000 acres of land for the purpose. The federal government has been convinced for 3 years now that Toronto needed a second airport. They considered no less than 59 sites, but couldn't settle on the final choice because the federal government wanted to put it west of Toronto, where most people live, and the Ontario government kept insisting on a site east of the city to promote growth in that area. In April, they announced the choice, Pickering, where land sales over a huge area have already been frozen to stop speculation. Local residents rallied angrily to both sides of the question. They formed POP, People Over Planes, POP, and POW, Progress Over Welfare, POW. POP is trying to convince the world that no second airport is needed, while POW has accepted the airport but wants to make sure everybody is well compensated for their property.
Well, it isn't needed. That's number one. It's a magnificent waste, and I use the word waste, well, of taxpayers' dollars. It's a terrible threat to the eastern door of Metro, the green door which allows Metro citizens to get out of the city. That door, that escape hatch, is going to be closed. There are other reasons as well. It is a personal injustice to some 32,000 people who live in that area. And this isn't counting the ones who are going to live in there in the future, because the area is just beginning to develop.
And I know the majority of people are in favor of this airport, and we know it's going to do us a lot of good. Taxes are extremely high. We do know that they want to develop east of Metro, and this is going to be less cost to come out in this area than it would to go to Scugog or elsewhere east of Metro. It's going to cost a lot less money.
Montreal's new airport at Saint Scholastique is due to open in late 1974. Work began on the project in 1970. Judging from the complaints of people whose land has been expropriated there, Pickering residents are smart to take a tough stand early.
L'économie de la région était basée sur
Agriculture has always been the
Maintenant, avec
mainstay of this
l'aéroport,
area.
l'agriculture devient marginale.
Now, with the
et puis elle
airport,
devient
farming
vraiment
is a
menacée
marginal
parce
business.
que, à cause des contraintes,
And it is really
qu'on va,
threatened because of
exiger
regulations
des
which don't allow certain
cultivateurs, comme par
crops.
exemple, telle culture qu'on ne permettra pas, à cause aussi de l'insécurité des
To make it pay, a
cultivateurs. Un
farmer has
cultivateur,
to
pour
plan
faire une agriculture rentable,
several years
doit
ahead.
voir des années à l'avance.
But he
Maintenant, aujourd'hui,
can't
il peut
do
plus
this
se permettre ça
anymore
parce que
because he
on sait
never
jamais quand
knows
est-ce qu'il
whether
sera
he'll be
envoyé
thrown
de
off
sa
his
terre,
land by the
s'il pourra continuer à
expropriations
cultiver,
or whether they'll let him keep
dans la
farming.
région expropriée, si le bruit lui permettra de rester.
Alors, c'est un peu comme si on arrivait là.
Well, it's like planting cabbages in a potato field.
Et puis, c'est ça qui est arrivé en fait.
People who make a living
L'agriculture
from
devient
farming
marginale, et la population qui vivait de l'agriculture et qui ne peut pas se
and who
recycler
can't get into construction work
dans des
because of the wrangling
situations,
between the federal and provincial governments on labor questions, and they can't get jobs in the construction or aviation industries because they don't have the training for it. We've never had unemployment here, but now a lot of people have been expropriated for a lot of money. And this takes away their ambition. In a few years, their money will be spent, and they'll be out of work, they'll have nothing. Already you can see a lot of apathy, and indifference, anxiety, and insecurity. You can't tell if Saint Scholastique has any future. They say there's a future, but plans don't allow for new construction. Many of the houses have been abandoned. Well, they tell us the village will stay, but houses without people are not houses. It will be a ghost town. That's the sort of information we don't have.
In view of the huge costs involved and the environmental impact, the big question is, why does Toronto need a new airport?
The facilities at Malton, within the 4,200 acres that we have there today, cannot provide the demand, I should say cannot meet the demand, beyond about 1980 at the latest.
Well, that's true. Malton is a terminal case. You see, the problem is they need terminals, and that copes with the passengers. The aircraft movements, Malton can cope with them, and this has been shown on numerous occasions by their own reports. When we talk about 250,000 aircraft movements per year, which could be anticipated by 1990, Malton can handle that, particularly with the present and newly developing navigation aids which enable faster handling of aircraft. There's no doubt that Malton can handle the expected passenger needs into the future. The thing is, the government is looking at this with a tunnel vision. Right now, 747s could have a second deck put on them at a minor expense, that's what they're built for, to transport 550 people at a time, rather than the 300 people they do at present. There's no need for it.
You don't think they need the fourth runway?
Oh, they do need a fourth runway, yes. I think they do need a fourth runway.
It would be very difficult to acquire the additional land. It's been estimated that the 3,000 acres would cost something like, well, the 3,000 acres would cost approximately $150 million. But that would just be for the airport operational area. To put the additional traffic through Malton on a fourth runway without affecting the, let us say, the lifestyle or the quality of life of the people who would be living in Brampton and Bramalea and certain parts of Etobicoke, if that fourth runway were built, would require purchase of considerably more land outside this 7,200 acres that I'm referring to. And it's been estimated that at least another $300 million would be required to purchase this additional land. It's interesting to note that 85% of the cost of a new airport is in terminals. Now, if the new airport were not to be built and an attempt were made to put all this traffic that we've talked about through Malton, additional terminals would have to be built in Malton. Additional land would have to be acquired to construct a fourth runway. But with 85% of the cost in terminals, this is more or less equal wherever you build it.
this is another thing that the airlines feel strongly about, that we want cheaper terminal accommodation. We don't want monuments to architects. I think the market here in Canada is probably the most price-sensitive market in the world. And what the passenger wants is cheap transportation. And cheap transportation dictates that we have cheap facilities for handling passengers. Well, the new terminal at Malton cost $23 million, I believe, when it's complete. So you're talking in terms of 1/10 of the cost of a new airport, probably, to develop Malton, something in that sort of region. So to my mind, it's a case of spending, say, $30 million or $300 million. And bear in mind that $300 million is your money.
The last time they tried to expand Malton, back in 1968, local residents complained bitterly about the noise, and the plan was dropped in favor of a 2-airport system. But an Ontario report 2 years later maintained that Malton can be expanded without more noise problems, and the cost would be up to 2/3 less than building a new airport. This was rejected because it took for granted certain technological advances for noise and air pollution control.
But the important point here is that technology is leading us to quieter aeroplanes. The 747 is much quieter than the 707 or the DC-8. BOAC has recently modified 3 of its 747s to cut the noise level by 30%. We're going to have our whole fleet modified by the end of the year. The Lockheed 1011 is the quietest of the wide-bodied airplanes flying today. And it is, the engineers tell us, that in the future we can expect to have a completely quiet aircraft engine and clean.
The Ministry of Transport believes that the clinching argument for the new airport is the potentially disastrous result of not buying the thousands of acres of land now instead of later.
Every possible public works which we're considering for the next 20 years, we should expropriate land right now. We need, and the government knows this, to plan and build a major airport. We need 7 years lead time. That is 7 years. If we postulate we need an airport in 1990, we should begin building it in 1983. It's our submission that Malton has already been demonstrated by government figures to be quite adequate to the year 1990, possibly to the year 2000.
The existing airport is 17 miles from downtown Toronto. Pickering is 29 miles. The distance between them is 30 miles.
And I know that if I'm going to travel to a domestic airport, I'm going to kick like the devil. If you tell me I now have to travel 40 miles in order to catch my flight to New York or my flight to London, I wouldn't put up with it, and neither will the passengers.
The roles that will be played by Malton and the new Pickering Airport are also under study. We're looking at 6 or 7 possibilities. But one possibility that immediately looks very promising is to move, with the full cooperation of the airlines, the long-range transatlantic scheduled air carrier operations to Pickering, also some charter operations to Pickering. Now, we realize that if you're going to have a large percentage of operations out of Toronto to Europe and to the Caribbean from the Pickering Airport, it's not too much of a problem for people residing in Toronto or the Toronto area. But there would be a problem for people coming from other cities in Canada, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Vancouver, who today would come into Malton and who would be faced with the problem of transferring by some kind of a ground link to the other airport. So one of the proposals is that a certain number of connecting domestic long-haul flights would also go into the Pickering Airport, thus obviating the necessity for that transfer on the ground.
Yeah, one of the problems there is duplication of airline services.
Our analysis of the situation is simply that the major airlines should be able to operate sufficient additional services because of the buildup of traffic out of the new airport without diminishing the service given at Malton, and do this economically. And also provide connections for the Air Canada in particular, providing connections for overseas flights.
Any split operation will increase our costs substantially. And we're in a very marginal business. And in a marginal business, when your costs go up, they very soon have to be passed on to the passenger.
Do you have all the information necessary to combat the government stand on this airport?
We at present have all the information necessary to show to a public inquiry that there's no need for a second airport.
Have all the documents, government documents and studies been released?
Oh, no. They're holding back. For example, Mr. McHugh released a series of documents last week, but he left off a very important one, left off a document which stated, this is a report that went to the Ontario Cabinet on December the 1st, 1971. The recommendations of that report are, this is quoting, that Malton be retained as the major flight facility serving the Toronto-centered region, and that 2 regional airports be built to act as reliever airports. And this is the recommendation that went to the Ontario Cabinet from their study team. The Ontario Cabinet saw fit to ignore that and to go ahead with agreeing that a new major airport would be located at the North Pickering site. Now, why didn't Mr. McHugh release that document in all frankness? That this has gone beyond the ability of anybody to make a sensible judgment of the merits of the second airport. We say, all right, let's have an umpire. That's what the Public Inquiries Act is for. We'll present our evidence, you present your evidence.
For yourself?
You're a through passenger? Any luggage?
Yes.
Oh, well, then you're going to have to wait for a second. You got in the wrong lineup somehow.
First of all, I'm going down to New York. Then I'm catching a plane to London.
Okay, so you're strictly in transit then?
Yes.
Intend to leave or sell anything in the U.S.?
Oh, heavens no. I don't even know anyone doing that.
Any alcoholic beverages with you? Strictly your own personal effects. Everything will go through to England.